Late summer always makes that town feel scrubbed clean. It's small and inland, with straight streets and clipped lawns, the kind of place that doesn't have a true downtown so much as a few useful buildings spaced apart. I worked from my laptop at the dining table, answered emails in the morning, and took an evening walk when the heat loosened. At 8:40 p.m. on Tuesday, I passed the mailbox at the corner lot, checked my own out of habit, and went back inside to lock up. Cicadas filled the air like static, and my porch light gave off a steady hum that I'd stopped noticing. If you want more accounts like this, quiet, plausible, and true to adult life, subscribe and I'll share the next one. Nothing felt wrong yet. Everyone else was excited for the county fair weekend. I was mostly relieved to be staying behind. The arrangement was practical. My sister and her family had driven out early to beat traffic, and my neighbor across the street was gone too, leaving me to keep an eye on both properties. It wasn't a favor that required much. Collect packages if any arrived, water a few plants, and feed a cat that would probably ignore me. I had deadlines that didn't care about fairs, and I didn't enjoy crowds enough to justify the drive. By Friday afternoon, the town thinned out in a visible way. The small grocery posted a handwritten sign about closing early. The diner lights were off. Trash pickup didn't happen. Still, the utilities were steady. My air conditioning ran, street lights came on, and the refrigerator motor cycled in the quiet like it was the only thing awake. Under the sink, I knew exactly where the spare key was taped because I'd checked it twice. On the first night, I noticed the streetlights stayed on past their usual shut-off. Normally, around midnight, the older lamps would blink down to a dimmer setting. That night they held full brightness, washing the street in a flat orange. The sodium buzz came and went, faint and uneven, like the current wasn't clean. Across the street, a porch light flicked on once, and then off again. It wasn't dramatic, more like a timer correcting itself. I stood at my window for a minute with my hands on the sill, watching for a second change that didn't come. I told myself it was power testing, or a maintenance schedule someone forgot to mention. The light pole outside number 214 had always been temperamental. By 12:30, I was back in bed, letting routine smooth it over. The second night was when the repetition began. At 2:12 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps on pavement. Not close, not far, at a distance that should have shifted as the walker moved along the street. Instead, the rhythm stayed consistent, as if someone was pacing in a fixed circle just beyond my porch light's reach. Shoes on pavement, a short pause, then the same measured steps again. No car doors, no voices, no dog tags, none of the messy sounds that usually come with a real person outside. During the day, I tried to keep things ordinary. I worked, I ate, I walked my usual loop before dusk. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, a tells me to keep writing it this way. By the third night, I started noticing small alignments. The mail in my box sat at a slightly different angle than I'd left it. Trash bins along the street were a few inches off their usual spots, all of them, as if someone had nudged them into a cleaner line. At 2:12 a.m., the footsteps returned identical. 3 nights in a row. What bothered me wasn't the sound. It was how the timing began to match me. The steps would start a minute or two after I turned off my bedside lamp. If I got up to use the bathroom, the pacing would pause, then resume when I was back in bed. On the 4th night, I tested it without thinking too hard. I moved from the bedroom to the kitchen and stood still in the dark, listening. The street was quiet. When I stepped into the hallway, the motion sensor's tiny indicator blinked once, and the porch light across the street came on for a moment, then off again. It felt less like observation and more like synchronization. I had no proof, only the kind of recognition you get when a pattern clicks into place. I stood there longer than was comfortable, then went back to bed without turning on any extra lights. Sometime after midnight on the 5th night, I saw a light in my neighbor's house. Not the porch light this time, an interior glow behind the front curtains, low and steady like a kitchen lamp. The neighbors were gone. I'd checked the spare key under my own sink cabinet earlier that day, because the thought of it had become a compulsion. I told myself the bulb had a timer, but I had been inside that house 2 days earlier to feed the cat, and the kitchen had been dark and empty. I put on socks and walked over without turning on my flashlight. The air outside was still warm, but the moment I stepped onto their back patio, the temperature felt cooler, like shade that shouldn't exist at night. The back door was unlocked. The knob turned with no resistance. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of clean dish soap and something stale underneath it. The floor tile was cool through my socks, and I had the sudden, childish awareness of how loud my breathing was. A chair at the table had been moved, angled about 15 degrees off square, precise enough to look intentional rather than careless. I didn't call out. I didn't step deeper. From somewhere beyond the kitchen, I heard controlled breathing. Slow, quiet, the way someone breathes when they're trying to be silent, but can't stop being human. It was close enough that if I moved forward, I would have to meet it. I backed out the way I came, closing the door as gently as I could, and I turned the deadbolt with 2 careful clicks. I didn't run. I walked back across the street, feeling the porch light hum above me like a thin wire, and I locked my own door with more force than necessary. Then I locked it again. I called the non-emergency line and reported what I could report. A house supposed to be empty, an unlocked door, a light on, no signs of forced entry, and a strong reluctance to investigate further. I kept my voice steady because there wasn't a language for what I'd heard that didn't sound ridiculous. I didn't say breathing. I said someone may be inside. After I hung up, I turned on every light in my house and left them on. I set my keys and phone on the table where I could grab them fast. I stayed dressed. I chose the back exit in my head, then the front, then the back again, as if planning could substitute for certainty. At 6:05 a.m., I brewed coffee out of habit and didn't drink it. Dawn flattened the street into ordinary shapes. There were no footprints in the dust. Nothing looked touched. Later, when my neighbor returned, the house appeared never entered. The cat was alive and indifferent. The locks worked. The kitchen chair was back in its proper place, square to the table. The responding officer had found nothing actionable, and I could tell by his tone he wanted me to accept that as closure. But the house had kept a record my eyes hadn't. In my own thermostat history, I found nightly changes, exactly 1 degree lower at 2:12 a.m., then back up before morning. The porch light timer, which I'd never adjusted, had been reset to match my routine, switching on a few minutes before my evening walk and off shortly after I came home. Those details weren't dramatic. They were worse than dramatic. They suggested someone had been keeping time with me, quietly, patiently, like they were learning a schedule rather than breaking into a house. I've replayed that weekend in my head the way people replay near misses on the highway, trying to locate the exact moment when an ordinary choice could have turned into something permanent. The town wasn't haunted in any way I can prove. It was simply empty enough that small adjustments became visible, and being alone made me measurable. Even now, when I visit, I don't check the mailbox at the corner lot after dark. I keep my porch light off permanently, and the street feels wider without it, like the distance has been returned to the night. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you want the next account, quiet, realistic, and unresolved. Early winter settled in quietly that year. I was in my mid-40s, working remotely as an analyst, living alone in a town that usually ran on routine more than energy. By December 3rd, most of the residents had cleared out. A prolonged power maintenance project in the surrounding region had pushed families to stay with relatives elsewhere. I stayed. My days followed a narrow loop: morning work calls, simple meals, short walks before the light faded. The house held heat unevenly. Radiators ticked and cooled in a steady rhythm that replaced conversation. The kitchen clock had stopped at 11:48 weeks earlier, and I hadn't bothered to fix it. With fewer cars and no open shops, the town felt preserved rather than empty, as if paused midweek. If you appreciate realistic accounts like this, you can subscribe for more quietly unsettling experiences. Nothing felt wrong yet, just reduced. Staying behind was practical. Deadlines were tight, roads were unreliable after snowfall, and I'd been asked to keep an eye on the municipal backup generator while the town was mostly unoccupied. It was a simple responsibility. Check logs remotely, confirm fuel levels visually every few days. The generator sat in a small shed behind the library, far enough from my house to stay out of mind. The town didn't feel abandoned. Street signage stayed lit. Water pressure held. The faint hum of the generator sometimes carried through still air, more felt than heard. It suggested readiness, not urgency. I told myself that systems were designed for moments like this. As long as nothing failed outright, there was no reason for concern. The first anomaly appeared in the generator logs. One morning, I noticed a usage entry at 3:06 a.m., during a night when I knew demand had been minimal. Outside, fresh snow lay undisturbed around my house and along the library path. No tracks. No signs of inspection or fuel delivery. I assumed automated cycling. Backup systems test themselves. It was an easy explanation, and I accepted it quickly. Still, when I stepped outside later, I listened for the crunch of dry snow underfoot and noticed how absent that sound had been overnight. I logged the entry and moved on, confident the system was doing what it was built to do. Over the next few nights, the pattern held. The generator activated after midnight, ran for the same duration, then shut down cleanly. Each log entry matched the last. At the same time, indoor temperatures shifted slightly without my input. I'd wake to rooms warmer than expected, heat rising too quickly from spaces that had been cold when I went to bed. The thermostat history showed repeated resets to 19 degrees Celsius. I worked through it methodically. Network scans showed town Wi-Fi access points activating briefly each night, then going dark again. It suggested routine checks, but the timing aligned too closely with the generator cycles. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, a like lets me know to continue sharing experiences like this. None of it was alarming on its own. Together, it suggested coordination without context. The unease settled when I stayed awake intentionally. On those nights, the logs remained empty. No generator activity. No temperature adjustments. The house felt different then, not quieter, but expectant, like it was waiting for something to resume. Once, I closed my laptop fully, unplugged it, and went to bed. In the morning, the battery was partially drained anyway. There was no visible cause. The realization wasn't dramatic. Systems were behaving as if accommodating someone else's presence, adjusting only when I wasn't observing. I couldn't prove it, and that made acting on it feel unreasonable. I continued my routines, now aware that attention itself seemed to interrupt whatever was happening. I decided to stay awake through the night and observe without interacting. I moved slowly from room to room, noting times, temperatures, and sound. At 3 a.m., the house was still. At 3:06, when I stepped into the hallway, the generator activated. The timing was exact. I crossed into the kitchen, and the hum intensified slightly, as if load had increased. When I returned to the living room, it stabilized. Each movement triggered a response. I tested it carefully, changing rooms, waiting, then moving again. The system followed me. Around 4 a.m., I passed the library on my way back from the window and saw its interior lights flicker on, just briefly, as I moved past. The building was locked. No alert sounded. I didn't investigate further. At 4:11 a.m., I went to the basement and flipped the main breaker. The generator shut down instantly. The sudden silence was complete, heavy, and unnatural. I stood still for several minutes, listening to nothing at all. Morning came without transition. The town was unnaturally quiet, even for winter. No alerts had been triggered overnight. No error reports populated my inbox. The systems behaved as if nothing had occurred. I packed a suitcase before sunrise, moving carefully, as though noise still mattered. Outside, cold daylight revealed no tracks near the library or along the road. Snow lay smooth and unbroken. I restored power briefly to confirm stability, then shut everything down again. There was no evidence to document, nothing concrete to report. By the time the sun cleared the low buildings, I was ready to leave, uncertain why urgency had replaced routine. Weeks later, I reviewed archived data out of habit. Access logs for the generator during December 3rd through 5th were missing, overwritten without annotation. The utility provider denied any remote testing or maintenance during that period. According to them, the town had remained inactive. No one mentioned the outage again. No follow-up emails arrived. My inbox stayed empty where reports should have been. The absence of explanation felt intentional, though I couldn't say by whom. The systems had worked as designed. That was the problem. They had worked too well, adapting to conditions that weren't officially present. I've come to believe the town was never empty in the way I assumed. The systems behaved as if occupancy was procedural rather than physical, responding to presence without requiring bodies. Since then, I avoid staying anywhere alone for extended periods. Automation feels less neutral than it once did. The kitchen clock in that house still reads 11:48. I left it that way. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you want the next account. Late spring gave the town a temporary, unfinished look. I was in my early 40s, working as an insurance documentation contractor, brought in to preserve records while a sinkhole survey pushed residents out. The evacuation was orderly. Streets were clean, houses locked, services paused without ceremony. Survey flags lined Main Street in neat rows, their colors dull against the pavement. Wind moved through empty trees with no human noise underneath it, just branches touching and separating again. I walked the blocks each evening to keep track of time, listening for anything that didn't belong and finding nothing. It felt procedural, like a building closed for inspection rather than a place people lived. I told myself the quiet was temporary, measurable, and unremarkable. If you value realistic accounts like this, you can subscribe for more grounded horror experiences. At that point, solitude still felt manageable. My assignment was straightforward: photograph interiors for claim continuity, so nothing could be disputed later. Baselines mattered. I stayed in a rented duplex near the edge of town, Unit B on the second floor. It was clean, sparsely furnished, and close enough to the main roads to leave quickly if needed. I expected the solitude to be useful, fewer interruptions, predictable days. Instead, it felt heavier than planned. Each room I documented absorbed sound differently. The camera shutter sounded too loud in empty spaces, as if the houses resisted being recorded. Still, I followed procedure. Door closed, photo taken, door locked again. I checked each brass deadbolt before moving on, telling myself repetition was professionalism, not anxiety. On the second afternoon, I found a door unlocked that I was certain I had secured hours earlier. The latch turned too easily. The brass deadbolt showed fresh scratches around its edge, shallow but deliberate looking. I assumed personal error. Fatigue can rewrite memory. I locked it again and began double-checking everything compulsively. Before leaving each property, I tested handles, looked for movement, listened. The houses stayed still. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Even so, I started photographing locks along with rooms, just in case. It felt unnecessary, but it made the work feel contained again. By evening, I was convinced the problem was attention, not intrusion. The irregularities returned through the photographs themselves. Reviewing files at night, I noticed furniture repositioned between shots. Chairs pulled back slightly, a lamp turned at a different angle. Timestamps were correct. The order was intact. My memory less so. I went back the next day and re-photographed the same rooms. They looked unchanged in person. On the camera screen, they weren't. One file, IMG_4472, appeared twice, identical except for a couch cushion pressed inward, as if recently used. During calmer moments, I paused to breathe and remind myself the town was empty. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, a like lets me know to continue sharing it. Outside, reflections in storefront glass showed brief interior lights behind me where no buildings should have been lit. When I turned, there was nothing. When I stopped working, the changes stopped too. The pattern became difficult to ignore. Movement only occurred when documentation began. The town didn't feel vacant, it felt responsive. To test it, I left the camera lens cap on for an hour and sat in silence. No doors shifted. No lights appeared in reflections. The wind moved through trees and then settled. When I resumed photographing, the unease returned immediately, subtle but present. The silence when I stopped felt restorative, like a system powering down. That was the moment I understood I wasn't observing a place. I was prompting it. I didn't know why, and I didn't know what it wanted, only that attention itself seemed to matter. That night, I resumed work deliberately. I chose a municipal building scheduled last and entered with my flashlight steady in my hand. At 11:32 p.m., as I climbed the stairwell, I heard footsteps pacing above me. The sound echoed without variation, as if confined to a small loop. The building was empty. I knew it was. I stopped on the landing and listened. The pacing continued, measured and patient. When I stepped up one more stair, it stopped. I took another step, and an interior light turned on in a locked office down the hall. The glow was soft, domestic, wrong for the space. I didn't finish the set. I left the camera and tripod where they were and exited the building without running. Outside, the night felt too open. I walked toward the edge of town, then broke into a brief, controlled jog until I reached my car. The flashlight beam shook in my hand, not from panic, but from the effort of staying quiet. I drove to the next town without stopping. Headlights cut through uninterrupted darkness, the road empty in both directions. At a gas station just past midnight, I kept the engine running while I paid, hands steady enough to count change. The fuel receipt printed at 12:14 a.m. The next morning, I reported incomplete documentation and cited a vague safety concern. I didn't elaborate. There wasn't language for what had happened that wouldn't sound speculative. The claims department acknowledged the report without questions. I slept poorly in a motel off the highway, listening for footsteps that never came, more unsettled by their absence than I expected. Weeks later, when I reviewed the submitted files, the photos had been reordered automatically. Metadata showed edits I hadn't made, access times that didn't match my activity. A folder I didn't create sat on my drive, renamed final_final, as if someone else had decided the work was complete. The claims department accepted everything silently. No corrections requested. No follow-up. My inbox stayed empty where clarification should have been. The computer fan ran constantly during review, even when no programs were open, a low mechanical presence that made the room feel occupied again. I sometimes wonder if the town needed witnesses more than residents, if documentation was a form of activation rather than record. I don't take documentation jobs anymore. I shifted to work that doesn't require entering empty structures. Even now, I check reflections before trusting a room to be empty. Screen glare still resembles interior lights when the angle is wrong. The camera I used that week sits unused in a drawer. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe for the next account.